Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Mahua Nigurkar. I am a faculty with the School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. The module that we will be discussing today is Monitoring, Assessment and Evaluation in Fieldwork. This is part of the paper Fieldwork and Field Supervision. Before we discuss the module in details, let us go over to the objectives of the module. So what will this module cover? Well, this module has three basic objectives. One is to have a basic understanding about the concepts of monitoring, assessment and evaluation in fieldwork. Second is to learn about monitoring, assessment and evaluation. How do these terms apply in fieldwork within the context of social work education? And third is to gain a basic understanding about the general parameters that are used while grading and evaluating fieldwork. So now we move on to some aspects of monitoring, assessment and evaluation. These are three interlinked terms and sometimes can be used interchangeably, though there are points of distinction as well. Now all three of them are very closely linked to the fieldwork objectives and the goals of fieldwork, as all of these processes, assessment, monitoring and evaluation, will be undertaken at different points in time during the fieldwork process to review whether the fieldwork objectives are being met or not and whether learning is optimally happening. Now, an important point to remember is that assessment, monitoring and evaluation can happen only if there is some concrete fieldwork happening at the fieldwork placement. So, even before we move on to processes of assessment, monitoring, evaluation, we need to plan our fieldwork well. We need to design the fieldwork program which is relevant to the objectives and goals. Otherwise, processes such as monitoring, assessment, evaluation will not have much relevance. So, planning for fieldwork is very important. And this planning for fieldwork, pre-placement, during placement, and for the placements for the coming years have to be closely linked with the objectives of fieldwork learning goals and the priority areas of the field placement or the agency or the organization where the student will be placed for a scheduled period of time. Now we move on to what is monitoring, assessment and evaluation. Now again, these are words that are commonly used. So these are not words that we are hearing or listening to for the first time, and most of us are quite clear about these terms. Nonetheless, when we are doing fieldwork or within the context of fieldwork or social work education, it is important to know what these terms mean and how important they are when we are doing our fieldwork and at the closure of the fieldwork setting. So monitoring, assessment and evaluation, all of them primarily refer to review of progress of work done, analyzing whether goals are being fulfilled, whether the outcome is happening as per objectives of the project. We will now take up each one of these terms separately. So we move on to monitoring progress at fieldwork. Before that, I would like to just share that fieldwork is an intense process for most students. And in fieldwork, the student learns to work in the agency, the field placement or the organization for a stipulated period of time. The student learns about the context of work, the issues the organization or the agency is working with, different ways to undertake social work intervention. During this process, student also learns to handle feelings, emotions, cope with difficult situations, cope with disappointments, as well as persevere and demonstrate sustained interest at work. Apart from this, the student is also expected to periodically submit fieldwork recordings and written documents, which becomes a written account of the student's work. And therefore, for all of these processes to happen optimally and for the student to benefit, monitoring thereby becomes an integral process of fieldwork, right from the time the placement is being planned or discussed to the time the student concludes fieldwork. Monitoring is required to ensure that the student is working at the right path, learning and progress is happening well, and mid-field work, if changes need to be done, they can be done so that things move better thereon and things happen smoothly. Now we will move on to who will monitor this work. Monitoring can happen at different levels and for different purposes. We as learners, we as students can always monitor our own work. We can reflect and review the progress that we are doing. Are we planning properly? Are we following the objectives that we are supposed to? Are things happening the way they are expected to? And whether there is some mid-course correction required. So self-monitoring is very, very important. Second, monitoring will happen with the student in an ongoing manner, along with the supervisor, along with the field instructor. So the field instructor and the supervisor of the student will also monitor the student's learning and progress of work. At the third level, monitoring will also happen at the agency or the organization where the student is placed. And all of these three form a triad: the student or the learner, the fieldwork placement or the organization, and the teaching institute from where the student has gone to the organization. So monitoring, all three of them are closely interlinked, and they keep discussing and keep analyzing and assessing whether work is smoothly progressing or not. Then we will move on to certain important elements of monitoring, that if we have to do monitoring, then what will we monitor? I strongly encourage you to read the written text, which has details on what all can be monitored, what all we should monitor, and so that we as students or we in the capacity of field instructors can plan fieldwork in a relevant manner. So some points I can touch upon now. That monitoring in fieldwork will include first assessing the situation and the current status of work. Is there enough work? Is there too much work? Is there inadequate work? Is the student getting overworked, or is the student having large periods of time and there is no work happening? So what is the current status of work? What is the time being allotted to it, and whether it is being optimally utilized? Second aspect of monitoring will be determining whether work is happening as per goals and objectives, and whether changes need to be made. So sometimes what happens is the goals and objectives of fieldwork may not match with what the agency or the field organization is expecting us to do. At such times, it's important to sit and discuss so that if changes, if required, can be made. The third very important aspect of monitoring is identifying the hurdles, problems, bottlenecks, and finding ways to resolve them. Also finding whether the student, for some reason, or we as learners, we can also self-monitor, and we can also reflect and analyze whether for some reason we are getting demotivated in the field, we are losing interest in our work, we have too much to do and we do not know how to go about it. So if we keep reviewing and assessing and monitoring our progress, our own feelings and thoughts on our fieldwork, and then we along with the concerned persons can sit and identify what are the hurdles or the problems or the bottlenecks that is coming in the way of work. Another very important aspect of monitoring is whether the time schedule is being maintained, because ultimately fieldwork is for a stipulated period of time. Secondly, when we go to the organization, when we are working with people, there is a commitment. So that work is also value based. There is a commitment that we will achieve what we have set out to do. Hence, maintaining time, maintaining a schedule, ensuring that we are respecting and adhering to that schedule is very important, and that is where monitoring plays an important role. Another aspect of monitoring can also be comparing notes with other experiences and applying some of the learnings. So we can share our experience with our other peers, with our batchmates, with other learners, compare notes with them, see what is working well for us, what is working well for them, and then through that process of peer sharing and learning or formal and informal meetings, we can review the progress of work being done. One more critical aspect of monitoring, and please do read the written text also, is giving timely feedback. There is no point only assessing the work, finding out whether things are happening and not happening, and then not giving a timely feedback. Because if we do not give a timely feedback either to ourselves or to the agency or to the learner, then how do we expect changes to happen if there is a need for making a change. Then we move on to assessment. As I mentioned earlier, monitoring, assessment, evaluation are interlinked. Nonetheless, we will look at these three components in a distinctive manner as well. So what is assessment? Assessment is an appraisal of the situation. It is looking at how things are happening and then taking a judgment call about the facts and situation. Now, assessment within the context of social work education, within the context of fieldwork, can be both formal and informal processes, can be periodic as and when required, can be at fixed intervals. Within the context of fieldwork, there are different tools of assessment. So when is assessment undertaken? While monitoring is usually an ongoing process, assessment can be ongoing, can be periodic, or scheduled at different phases of the fieldwork placement. Assessment is usually undertaken pre-placement, midway through the placement, and end of placement. Some specific assignments and projects too may be given to the learners, or we may take on some projects for our own assessment. Now, what could be some of the commonly used tools of assessment in fieldwork? This list or what I'm going to share is not exhaustive. We may have other tools of assessment as well, but some of the common tools of assessment are A. Verbal feedback. So we give a feedback to our learners through informal meetings, through formal processes, and that feedback need not only be negative. It can be a positive feedback, so whatever the learner is doing or whatever we as students are doing well, it gets reinforced and we continue to do that. Feedback can also be in the form of constructive criticism, where we enable our learner to reflect on things that are not going so well and correcting the course of action. So assessment can be through verbal feedback. It can be through a discussion with a student. Again, a discussion can be formal, informal. It can be group discussion among peers. Again, formal, informal processes. Assessment can also be through written reports, comments, written feedback given to the learner. Sometimes assessment is done after obtaining a feedback from the beneficiaries or the participants or the people that we were working with. So feedback is not necessarily only between the learner and the field instructor or the supervisor. Feedback can also come from the organization. Feedback can also come from the people that we are working with. We can have individual and group meetings with students. There can be three-way meetings, there can be one-on-one processes, and assessment also invariably happens at the end of the fieldwork placement. So there are different ways in which we can both monitor and thereby assess the students' fieldwork progress, learning and growth. Now, what will be assessed? Monitoring and assessment will go hand in hand. Assessment usually includes the following parameters. 1. Extent of fulfillment of fieldwork objectives. 2. Extent of planning of fieldwork. 3. The implementation processes undertaken. 4. Knowledge building. 5. Skill development, thinking, writing and direct practices and people-centered work. 6. Integration of values, principles and ethics of social work. This is a very, very important component of fieldwork and all of our social work education. Social work education and fieldwork is value-based. There is a context to learning. There is a recognition to human dignity and the values with which we approach people and work with them. So integration of values, principle and ethics of fieldwork becomes a very important component of both fieldwork recording as well as assessment. Then comes ability to overcome biases and prejudices. Again, very important component or parameter of assessment. This assessment we can do at the level of the self. This assessment can also happen between the learner and the field instructor or the supervisor. The last important parameter of assessment, but not the least, is the ability to develop interpersonal relationships at all levels. Field work and person-centered work or people-centered work requires us to be able to work with people at all levels in different ways. So the ability to develop interpersonal relationships, ability to have communication skills, ability to communicate in a language of dignity and empowerment, ability to work in a team, as well as the ability to work independently as and when the need may arise. All of this will form parameters of assessment. As mentioned before, assessment can happen through formal and informal processes. Now we move on to evaluation. Evaluation is similar to assessment. However, within the context of fieldwork education, evaluation will have a quantifying outcome in terms of a score or a grade or marks that we give to the learner or a student. Hence, often evaluation, apart from including monitoring and assessment processes, will focus on achievements, will focus on output and outcomes. Within fieldwork evaluation processes, there may be a specific schedule and there will be formal processes of evaluation. Now we move on to a very important component of fieldwork, and that is fieldwork grading and evaluation. This is very important for both the learners as well as the fieldwork instructor or the supervisor who is grading and assessing and evaluating the students' growth and learning. Fieldwork grading and evaluation is a challenging process as it attempts to quantify the students' learning and experience, both tangible and intangible outcomes, into a specific score or grade. There are many aspects to fieldwork that require assimilation over a period of time. While specific programs and activities, writing and or communication skills can be measured in terms of output and outcome, other areas of professional development, such as development of critical thinking, application of social work values, integrity at work, skill development, do take time to absorb and assimilate. Nonetheless, the evaluation process is very important as it gives an indication to their students about their learning, their performance, and their overall growth in their journey towards becoming an effective social worker. What are the commonly used parameters of grading and evaluation? Each field institute, each training institute, each curriculum does develop its own formats, does develop its own parameters of assessment, does develop its own forms. Some of the commonly used parameters of grading and evaluation are: 1. The student is assessed and evaluated often on the extent of understanding the fieldwork placement agency or organization or context of work. This could include understanding the profile of the agency, the issues the agency is working with, social work approach and intervention, understanding staffing pattern and roles, having administrative related clarity, etc. Second is the extent of social work intervention, either something the student has learnt about or something the student has directly participated in. Social work intervention could include the planning process, extent of planning. How did the program get implemented? To what extent resources were mobilized, skills utilized, the outcome of the program, overall impact or overall influence the program may have had. So many things directly, indirectly related to social work intervention can be evaluated. Many times students can be in the capacity of initiating an intervention program themselves, or working in a team, or being part of a large intervention programs where they were observer. So evaluation naturally would depend on and be relevant to the student's level of initiative and the scope that the student got in getting involved in that intervention program. The third is again linked to assessment is ability for interpersonal and purposeful relationships. This is again very important. Relationships can be informal at the fieldwork setting, but relationships have to have a purpose. Relationships have to be developed consciously, keeping social work values and principles in mind, keeping in mind the commitment that we've made to ourselves and to the agency organization that we are working with. Purposeful relationships would include team building, purposeful and constructive relationship with field instructor, other people in the agency, with one's peers, the other field contact persons who may have facilitated our learning and growth in the agency. It may include processes of communication, rapport building, etc. So everything within the arena of relationships can be assessed and evaluated by the student, by themselves, or in discussion with the fieldwork instructor and the supervisor. The fourth parameter is level of writing skills. This would include recording skills, documentation, timely submission of different kinds of recordings, willingness and ability to write different kinds of records as per the fieldwork requirements. So a whole area of writing skills, skills related to documentation can be one of the parameters for grading and evaluation of fieldwork. The fifth parameter is enhancement of professional development. The growth of the self and professional development is integral to social work education and plays a very, very important role in fieldwork as well, where we are directly interacting and working with people who are affected by the issues that we discuss in our classroom. So professional development will include components such as integrity, commitment to work, honesty, values, ethics, self-awareness, willing to change, etc. Then comes another parameter, which is any special programs or projects that the student on their own initiative may have undertaken. So those special programs and projects also need to be evaluated and assessed appropriately. Finally, the overall growth and development of the student. While evaluation and grading can have different components, can have different segments, ultimately the learning has to be holistic. So the learner has to have a sense that there has been an all-round level of learning and development in different aspects of fieldwork. So fieldwork grading and evaluation usually ends or can end with an overall assessment of the growth and the development holistically that has happened in the student's life while they embarked on the fieldwork process. Moving on very briefly, what could be the 3 C's of fieldwork evaluation? I would look at it as consolidation, culmination and closure. So the 3 C's of fieldwork evaluation: consolidation, that we consolidate our learning through this entire fieldwork process that we have undertaken, through monitoring, through assessment, through evaluation, through timely feedback, through self-analysis, we learn, and towards the end of fieldwork, we kind of put that learning in a holistic frame. Culmination. Ultimately, fieldwork comes to an end. It culminates with a process of evaluation. It culminates with a process of grading. And thereafter, closure to that fieldwork process. Though the fieldwork placement may come to an end, the learning continues. The student leaves that fieldwork agency or organization with that learning, and that learning the student or the learner is able to apply in other settings as well. So the evaluation process is not only about grading and slotting the student within a particular score of or marks. Though that is important, it is not the only purpose of evaluation. Assessment and monitoring are processes that happen at different phases of fieldwork and may not always cover all areas of fieldwork simultaneously. It depends on the priority area at a certain point in time. End of placement evaluation is the summing up of fieldwork and reflecting on the entire experience. It is a time to assess the overall consolidation of learning and review the progress made. Those students are motivated to undertake fieldwork not just to obtain grades. Effective fieldwork does culminate into a deserving or a good grade or a good score. A positive evaluation and a grading is also an appreciation and acknowledgement of the student's engagement. Finally, the end of placement evaluation also brings closure to fieldwork. The student is encouraged to apply the learnings and insight from fieldwork. One very important point that I would like to conclude this presentation or this discussion is with the guiding principles in monitoring, assessment and evaluation. There are certain principles on which we could monitor, assess and evaluate work. These principles are based on core values and principles of social work. These principles become critical, especially when we are monitoring or guiding or assessing or evaluating fieldwork students within social work context. First principle, monitoring, assessment and evaluation must be relevant to the fieldwork objectives and goals. Second, students or learners must be aware about the parameters for grading and evaluation and indicators of good performance, and it should not come as a surprise to the student or the learner. At the beginning of the placement process itself, student must be aware of these things. Third, planning must be done with the students about the schedule for both monitoring, assessment as also for fieldwork, because only when fieldwork is relevant and meaningful, these processes of monitoring and assessment will also be very relevant and meaningful. Another important principle which I think we must keep in mind or recognize is that each student or each learner is unique with different learning needs and may progress at a different pace. Hence, it's very important to start at the level of the learner and at the pace at which the student is learning. Comparing between students and learners does not really help for each student or learner to optimize on their own talents or skills. So it's very important to recognize that each student is unique, each learner is unique, and we must recognize and identify how best to harness and optimize their potential and how to give them constructive feedback so that they can further work on their areas of learning and development. Another very important principle is on feedback. Feedback by student and supervisor or between student and supervisor must be timely so that changes can be made as and when required. Feedback also has to be constructive. The objective of the feedback must be to enable the student to do better and not to decrease the morale or self-confidence of the student. The whole purpose of feedback, even when we as learners or students are reflecting on our growth or progress, it is to find out how can we do better. So any kind of feedback, it is to find out how best we can optimize on our strength. It cannot be used to demoralize or to decrease the self-confidence of the student or the learner in any which way. Feedback, assessment, monitoring, these are all two-way processes, and hence mutual communication, planning, discussion on all these processes are required. The process of assessment must be democratic and needs to be objective. Language and communication during monitoring, during assessment, during evaluation, or while giving feedback must be respectful. No personal or demeaning remarks is acceptable. Feedback and monitoring is also very, very important to endorse and emphasize what is going well. Good work needs to be appreciated, good work needs to be recognized so that student can do even better than what they had started out with. So to summarize this whole discussion, monitoring, assessment and evaluation are important tools that facilitate learning during fieldwork. They are ongoing processes and need to be undertaken systematically and with clear objectives and purpose. In this presentation, we covered the different aspects of monitoring, assessment and evaluation, as well as some of the critical guiding principles for the same. As students or supervisors or field instructors or learners, we need to have clarity on these terms so that we can use these tools to optimally develop ourselves, or we can use these tools to optimize the student or the learner's potential and development. So do look up the references that is there with this module. Do read up the text, go through the self-assessment, and I'm sure you will find this presentation as well as the reading both engaging and informative. Thank you so much.